Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 9th of July, 2012, the podcast that feels your pain. This is your host, Shane Killian, and this week we have a special ObamaCare edition where we'll be discussing the recent Supreme Court decision upholding that Obamacare is constitutional and that water is also wine. Joining me this week, he's the Libertarian candidate for Florida House District 14. You may know him as FS Blue Apocalypse on the Bogosity.tv forum. Welcome back to the show, Jonathan Loche.
Great to be back, and not under the best of circumstances, unfortunately.
Why is that?
I would rather not be discussing how the last potential decision about constitutional government didn't go in the way we would have liked, so the Constitution at this point now is little more than toilet paper. That's what it is at this point.
Well, I know we were all hoping for better news.
It's just a very sad day.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about this, and of course we'll be talking about government health care. And you know, whenever we discuss government health care, there are the inevitable comparisons to Canada. And all the time I hear from people complaining that only Americans complain about Canada's healthcare, when obviously we don't know anything about it. They say, why don't you talk to an actual Canadian? Well, joining me this week is an actual Canadian. You may know him as Lord T. Hawkeye on YouTube and the Bogosity.tv forum. Welcome back to the show, Tim Dyson.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be on again. And, as a Canadian myself, I don't consider the recent decision to be a proud moment in America's history at all. No more than I consider when Canada did it.
When did Canada do it?
It was a couple decades ago. It started in Saskatchewan. The government went over to take over healthcare. The doctors actually didn't like it. They protested it, and they were effectively forced at gunpoint back to work.
Wow. What was the healthcare like before then?
It was, everyone just did their own thing. The government really wasn't involved in it at all. And lo and behold, I don't recall any stories of poor people dying in the streets like everyone likes to claim.
So what was the excuse the government used for getting into it?
Pretty much the same as America's. It was, they said, we can make it work better. There's people slipping through the cracks and all this sort of thing. And really all it was a couple doctors who didn't really like having to compete with other doctors, didn't like being at the mercy of how their patients believed they performed, and they wanted government to socialize it so they could make more money and have much more secure jobs.
Yeah, that actually sounds similar to how it kind of started in America in the 60s. I think we've all heard Ron Paul talking about when he started practicing medicine, and he got paid the equivalent of like $10 an hour after you adjust for inflation. And healthcare was cheap, and doctors made house calls, and they never turned anyone away. If they couldn't pay, they just treated them for free. And then government got in to fix healthcare, and it really seemed like it was, like you said, some doctors, and they wanted to be able to get the big salaries and get BMWs and things like that. And so what they were saying was, this is going to bankrupt the healthcare system if we keep paying these poor doctors a pittance. And so that's when all the screws were put on, with the licensing and everything. And so now we have a shortage of doctors, and it's so competitive in medical schools to get degrees so you can get a license because there are just only so many that they can give out. And then when they get in their residencies, they're extremely overworked. And it just all snowballed from there because, of course, it got more expensive because you had to pay doctors more because there was a shortage of supply. And they said, we need Medicare, and then we need Medicaid, and then we need the HMO Act, and then we need all these different reforms. And 45, 50 years later, here we are. And it's really always been strange to me that people say, hey, healthcare has been in shambles for quite a while. I might not say shambles, but it certainly has a lot of problems with it. No one seems to say, hey, all this other stuff the government's been doing for the last 40 years or so hasn't worked. Why don't we roll that back and then try something different? But no one seems to say that.
And that is the first sign that you're dealing with a scam. Like, if I say I'm going to fix your septic tank and I end up blowing the whole thing sky high, if I show up at your door saying, I am so sorry, please just give me a chance, I can fix this. Now you might think I'm sincere there. If I try to pretend the whole thing never happened, like everything's going swimmingly and I just need a little more money, you're going to immediately know I'm completely lying here.
Or especially if you tried to blame someone else for it. Because I mentioned the HMO Act. That was one of the big things people complained about in the 90s and on into the aughties. It was HMOs are terrible. This terrible creation of the free market that ruined our healthcare. Look at what the free market did with the HMO. Excuse me, 1973 HMO Act. Anyone? HMOs are a creation of government.
Yeah, I had people try to hit me with that excuse once. I linked them to the HMO Act on Wikipedia, and suddenly they never brought that up again. They just jumped to another tree and continued to attack me for the horrible person that I was.
Yeah.
A friend of mine's dad has a highly successful family practice, owns his own building, has a half dozen other doctors and PAs who work for him. And he pretty much said, after this ruling and over this, he said, if I had to do it all over again, I just would have been a PA. You get the same education with 1/10 of the headaches and 1/10 of the debt.
Well, I've heard of doctors giving up their practices to become like realtors and things. It was like they paid all this money and went into all this debt to get this degree and then, spend most of the day filling out paperwork instead of seeing patients and having to abide by all these government rules, especially if they take Medicare and Medicaid patients. And a lot of them just got fed up with it and stopped being doctors. And that, of course, contributed to the shortage.
The real tragic thing about socialism and things like that is when you first put it in, it actually works pretty decently because you're still hiring from the free market. You're hiring from doctors who got in because they like the competitiveness. They still have their work ethic. They still have their relationship with their patients and all this sort of thing. Yeah, at first it seems to work okay because you get the nice pay, but you still have the free market work ethic and everything like that. So people look back on those times and think, oh, it works so great. If only we could get that sweet spot again. But it doesn't work like that, unfortunately.
Well, that's how all unsustainable systems are. If you pop the hood on your car and you go and really juice it up and do all this and you get this real high-performance car and you go zooming it around and traveling at high speed, the car's going to run great for a little while and then you're going to blow out the engine.
Much like drugs, actually, if you think about it. There's a high and then there's a low.
Oh, that's another good analogy, yeah. Well, and your brain adjusts to the chemistry of the drugs you're taking if you're a regular drug user. Then over time what ends up happening is you're just taking the drugs, not to get the high or whatever, but just to get back to where you would be ordinarily before you started taking the drugs, because your brain's compensated for all that.
Yep. And that's the problem, because then when you try to tell the person that drugs are bad for you, you got to stop doing that, you're not trying to help them, you're trying to drag them back into that pit they're in when they're not taking it. So that's why people get so defensive about this sort of thing.
Well, and that's what you're saying, if we stopped all this, there'd be a recession. Well, there might be for a little while, just like if you're a heroin addict and you stop taking heroin, you're not going to feel too good. Hey, when a heroin addict's going through withdrawal, you know what a great way to make him feel good is?
That's that.
Give him more heroin. That'll make him feel good.
Yeah.
But it won't solve the problem. No. It'll just keep kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, you can't solve a problem with the same kind of thinking that caused it in the first place. You have to change your thinking.
Exactly. So let's talk then about Obamacare. I have a link in the show notes to a PDF file that's all 900 and whatever many pages, which of course they had to pass before we could find out what was in it. So what actually was in this thing?
There was only one page that I needed to read. There was a page that specifically exempts everyone in Congress and a couple other select groups from all the terms of it. I mean, if that does not tell you everything you need to know, I don't know what will.
Doesn't Canada do the same thing? Didn't they exempt their ministers or whatever they have up there?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's not fun. I mean, I tell people who defend that all the time. They say, oh, it's so great. It says, oh, yeah, you think Stephen Harper gets on the waiting list when he needs to see the doctor? Oh, no. Because socialism's for the peasants. It's not for the elite. A lot of government workers have been sending their own people to private clinics to get them back to work faster. The private clinics they won't let us use.
You're actually prohibited from using a private clinic?
Well, on paper, yes, but there's lots of people who do it anyway, and really, there's no way to enforce it without looking like first-class jerks, so it's a bit uneasy, but technically, private clinics are not allowed, but they practice openly all the time anyway, and really, who's going to try and shut them down?
Just like you can buy marijuana on every other street corner.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the biggest thing about it is the individual mandate. That's certainly the one that got the most press.
Yeah, the providing you with health care by forcing you to buy it.
Well, it's not even that. It's just taxing you if you don't.
It is the single largest tax increase on the American citizenry, and so Barack Obama ladies and gentlemen, bailing out Wall Street, taxing Main Street.
Yeah, it's an interesting little situation they've got themselves into. The reason why they call it a tax is because they can't call it a fine, because if they call it a fine, then you have to go through due process, and the Supreme Court, I believe, admitted themselves that if it's a fine, that would make it a violation of the Constitution. But then if it's a tax, that makes Obama in violation of his campaign promise to not raise taxes and causes a whole bunch of other problems, so now they've kind of written themselves into a corner. They seem to jump back and forth between the two. Whenever you call them out on one, they jump to the other one.
Well, and the law itself, the Affordable Care Act, is pretty clear. They refer to it as a fine, as a penalty. They never actually refer to it as a tax. The only thing it ever even says about it is that the fines are to be collected by the IRS. And so somehow the Supreme Court was able to say, oh, well, since it was the IRS that was doing it, that makes it a tax. Even though this had been brought up before, the people who passed the law said it's not a tax. Barack Obama said it was not a tax. All the time they were defending it to the public. Oh, it's not a tax. It's not a tax. It's not a tax. And then it goes to the Supreme Court, and it turns out as soon as it's unconstitutional, if it's not a tax, all of a sudden it's a tax.
Brilliant. Truly brilliant.
Although, one thing that, silver lining, this isn't what the individual mandate is to do with the one thing that the Supreme Court did strike down, which was forcing states to massively increase Medicaid, or else they'd have all their Medicaid funds slashed.
Right.
Apparently, using the same logic, the current highway bills that make 21 the legal minimum drinking age, the de facto, are unconstitutional.
That's true. Well, what they actually said was they could withhold the extra amount they were giving states for Medicare and Medicaid under ObamaCare, but they just couldn't withhold the amount they were already giving the states.
It's a minor victory, but it's still an interesting one. The fact that federal highway funds are tied to making sure the drinking age is 21 versus, I'm sure at least several states would certainly like to lower it to 18.
But I mean, if you really tried to get this to the Supreme Court and say, hey, let's challenge the drinking age based on highway funds using the Obamacare ruling as a precedent, how do you think they'd go? I mean, there's all these 5-4 rulings.
Well, it's funny because Montana sued the federal government. I think they were the last state that ended up changing from 18 to 21. The Supreme Court found was in favor of the federal government, even though 15 years later they would have issued the exact opposite ruling.
And, everyone talks about the Supreme Court. Well, they're the ones that know what the Constitution says. And if what they're doing is like this perfect scientific interpretation of the Constitution, then why do we have all these 5-4 rulings that seem like they could go either way? I mean, it seems to me that, at least with the Supreme Court we have right now, you might as well toss a coin. Heads, it's constitutional. Tails, it's unconstitutional.
I mean, when's the last time you saw a scientific theory with a vote that ended up like that?
Yeah, they didn't do the Higgs particle this way. They just discovered that. They didn't do the Higgs particle and say, okay, we voted 5-4 in favor of the Higgs particle. It doesn't work that way.
Something you mentioned earlier, how when they say this is a big healthcare reform, and what's conveniently absent is anyone mentioning, well, doesn't that mean everything you did to reform healthcare before was a failure?
Yeah.
The government in healthcare is that a family member or your friend who, get straight, I'm going to give me another $40, go buy groceries, and instead they go right past the grocery store and right to the liquor store.
Yeah.
At the very least, if my cousin ever comes begging me for money, I just take him to the damn grocery store instead of giving him the money, but...
Yeah, but you can't really do that with government. You can't really... Government's the one with the guns. Government takes you places. You can't take the government places to make sure they do it right.
So, yeah, it's even worse than that. It's the alcoholic, druggy cousin shows up on the doorstep with the gun and just takes the $100 out of your wallet.
Yeah.
And like the druggy cousin, he tries to guilt trip you if you refuse, tries to make it out like you're the bad guy if you won't give him the stuff.
Yeah, there were a couple of things in the Supreme Court decision that some people are calling silver linings, because one of the arguments they made was that the government has the power to do the individual mandate under the Commerce Clause. And of course, they've been using the Commerce Clause for just about everything. Every time they try to do something, they try to work the Commerce Clause into it somehow. And the Supreme Court came down pretty handily on the idea that, no, that's not what the Commerce Clause is about. It has to do with commerce, actually buying and selling things, not inaction, not buying. And the government can't really do it one way or another. They can't force you to buy. They can't force you not to buy. They're just supposed to regulate the actual commerce and make sure that that's what's able to happen, people doing commerce from state to state. So that was actually a tiny little bit of backtracking by the Supreme Court on the Commerce Clause.
Personally, I think the Commerce Clause died a long time ago when you had the war on drugs. I mean, is that not people wanting to engage in a transaction and you stepping in saying, no, you can't do that because I don't like it? Two people wanting to engage in a contract of some sort and government stepping in and saying, no, you can't do that, even though both parties are completely compliant in it. I mean, heck, you could even make that argument for gay marriage if you really wanted to stretch it.
Well, the Commerce Clause died in the 30s when DR decided that growing corn in Iowa and selling it to Iowa-based companies was still somehow interstate commerce.
Yeah, even though it was within a state, it was intrastate.
Yeah.
Oh, but I can top you that one pretty good.
Go ahead.
Larkin Rose told this story. This fellow, he had a farm. He grew his own food, grew his own crops and stuff, and used them himself. He didn't even sell them to anybody, and the feds came over and said, oh, that's interstate, you have to pay us or whatever. He didn't even sell it to anyone. It never even left his own property. But they argued, oh, but because by not buying other people's stuff, he still had an effect on the economy. I mean, that was the line of reasoning they were using here. I mean, that is absolute insanity.
Yeah, they've done that a few times, and they're doing it with stuff now like raw milk and trying to step in and stop the sale of raw milk, even if it's just like an Amish guy selling it to his neighbors or something.
I feel so much safer now.
Joseph Keller couldn't have figured out a better catch-22 than that.
Well, the other silver lining has to do with our other old friend, the necessary and proper clause, because that's something else. It's the law is necessary and the law is proper, so we get to do it, and the justices disagreed with that. In the majority opinion, it's confirmed what the Constitution actually says is that it's only necessary and proper to implement a power that the Constitution has already granted to the government. So if it's necessary and proper to build a post office or do something to help the Navy or something like that, but it has to attach itself to some other power in the Constitution. So that seems to be another part where they've kind of gone back a little bit, gone back to what the Constitution actually says as opposed to the way they've misinterpreted it to be. Yeah, but I mean, you can kind of understand reading these first couple of pages of the decision why Fox News and CNN and all these other news outlets, they wanted to be the first to report on, was it, ruled in favor, was it ruled against? And so they read the first page or the first two pages or something, and they said, yeah, they struck it down. They said it doesn't do the Commerce Clause. They said it doesn't allow by the necessary and proper clause. And then just a few minutes later, they turned over to page 4 and it's oh, it's a tax.
Oh, dear.
They can allow it as a tax.
And seeing the video we saw a while ago of Peter Schiff discussing with all those other people, there's a common theme I noticed with them. The way they argue it, they only judge it based on what it says on the tin, only on the label, only what it says it does. I never heard one single liberal in that whole thing actually quote something from the bill to back their point up, or say, okay, it says this here on page whatever. No, it's just all labels, nothing else. It's like saying, oh, the Patriot Act is patriotic because it says so right there. They couldn't say that if it wasn't true.
But I mean, this whole tax thing, they can tax you if you don't buy insurance. So in effect, it's still a penalty. So what they've done is they've set a precedent, which I think completely blows away these silver linings of saying the government can restrict you from doing anything you want as long as they can tax you for doing it or for not doing it or whatever. So it's we've got this pesky Roe versus Wade thing. Well, we don't like that, so what we're going to do is we're going to institute a pregnancy tax, but if you bring your child to term, you'll get that tax credited, and it's only if you get an abortion that you end up having to pay the tax. I mean, what's the difference? Why couldn't they do that? I mean, it goes right along with this precedent.
Yeah, if that's not enough for you, even if we assume they're not going to expand this any more than they have now, yeah, right.
Oh, they're already expanding it.
Of course. But there's still the economic problems with this. What are people naturally going to do in the face of this, now that they've also been guaranteed can't turn them down for a pre-existing condition? Well, the economical thing to do, if the fine is relatively light right now, would be to just eat the fine, wait until you actually get sick, then buy insurance, and then get your big payout for when you're sick. That sounds great until you think, well, where is that money coming from? So the only way this can happen is the cost of insurance is going to get jacked up, and eventually that's going to lead to the fine also getting jacked up. There is no way it can't, mathematically.
And that's something that Harry Browne pointed out, because that's what the Republicans wanted to do. They went against Hillary Care, but they wanted to say, oh, well, we're in favor of health care too, so here's the things we want to do. And pretty much those things that they wanted to do ended up becoming Obamacare. You know, all these Republicans are railing against it. Well, this is what the Republicans back in the 1990s wanted.
Even now, Mitt Romney, he was trying to enforce a bill pretty much like this in his own state. Now suddenly he's against it when Obama's doing it across the country. So apparently doing it within his own state is okay, but doing it across the country is bad.
Somebody actually pinned Romney down on this issue, and more or less Romney was like, well, states' rights, guys.
Yeah, his thing is repeal and replace Obamacare. And someone tried to pin him down. It was like, okay, well, what are you going to replace it with? He says, well, I'll replace it with this and that and that and this. And it was all the stuff that's in Obamacare to begin with. So Romney wants to repeal Obamacare and replace it with Obamacare.
And people tell me there's still a choice in the political system. What choice? Where? I'm sorry, but the keep your own stuff party doesn't exist.
Yeah, it does. It just gets marginalized at every turn. Here's a good example of the American political process. We booked a library for Gary Johnson's first visit to Jacksonville. We booked this about a month in advance. 2 days before the visit was scheduled, the library calls it up and says, well, it's against policy to have political parties and political events. The Green Party has its monthly meetings on like the second Saturday in the local library I go to. One of the young Republican groups has a meeting at another library. What the hell? Just because we're a party that might not be the favorite among librarians, we get kicked out of a building our tax dollars used to create?
Yeah, well, you're a hypocrite, though, for wanting to use that library because you're a libertarian, and any time a libertarian uses something done by the government, they're a hypocrite.
Oh, I've been hit by that one a lot, too. I've even been hit by people who say, if I don't actually own a gun, I'm a hypocrite for supporting the right to bear arms.
Yeah, because you have to be gay in order to support gay marriage. You have to do drugs in order to be against the war on drugs. So, of course, why not?
Oh, yeah, people find it baffling that I'm not a pothead, and yet I still oppose the war on drugs. I mean, what's one of the greatest tests of integrity? Defend people you don't agree with.
Yeah, I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Indeed. There was even a case I had to defend white supremacists. Believe me, I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're only going to support your principles when it feels good to do so, then are they really principles to begin with?
Exactly. That's what principles are all about. You don't get to pick and choose. Principles are all about sticking to what you know what's right, even if it happens to be inconvenient for you.
I was saying the same thing to a member of the local Occupy group. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the pastor down in Gainesville, Florida, who's multiple times tried to threaten to burn Quran, and a group here in Jacksonville voted, let him come speak, and I was like, listen, I'm not Pat Condell. My hatred of Islam doesn't transcend my ability to put principles forward. I disagree with him to all hell, and I will be out there to protest him, but I still respect his rights to speak in front of a group of people that have invited him to speak.
Exactly, yeah. Is that Pastor Terry Jones guy who went around the whole blog sphere a few years ago?
Yes, that's him.
I only remember his name because of the Monty Python Terry Jones.
It was doubly sickening because he was speaking to the local Republican Liberty Caucus, so it was double a test of my principles.
Well, good for you then. Well, there is one news story I wanted to look at, not so much for actually covering their reporting, but they did have a couple interesting facts in there. Like, for example, the Obamacare bill itself, as anyone downloading the PDF can see, is like 900 and some pages, which Congress didn't read. But now, there's already 13,000 pages of regulations that have come up around Obamacare.
All the people I have debated with over the years, I swear I'm going to get in writing from all of them, you are not allowed to claim lack of regulation if things go bad again.
Right.
That card is gone. I mean, if it wasn't gone before, it's gone now. There's no argument to be made.
Not only that, there's like 180 regulatory groups And they're also preparing to give over $600 billion in subsidies to insurance companies over the next 10 years. So this is Obamacare. Insurance companies are terrible. Let's give our money to insurance companies.
I mean, I've had people seriously argue that this bill is just sticking it to insurance companies. I say, yeah, by forcing you to buy your stuff. Yeah, you sure showed them.
Yeah.
Probably my mom's best friend. She works for the Department of Children and Families in Florida, which, amongst other things, oversees Medicaid and Medicare, and she was showing me the other day a binder of new regulations that are going to be coming apart as part of Obamacare. We're talking probably a good solid 4-inch thick binder of new things that are going to be the result of this law. It's just mind-boggling. When you have like 10 pages describing, okay, these are the rules, and then another 100 pages describing the exceptions to the rule, it's like, why did we bother having rules in the first place?
Well, and one example of this that actually got a lot of attention is the mandate on contraception. Now, I actually looked through, I didn't read the whole thing because it's about the size of Atlas Shrugged and almost as hard to read, but I did a search through there for contraception, and there's only one place where this bill talks about contraception. And that is when it's talking about giving money to states for sex education, for educating children about contraception. There's nothing in there at all that says that insurance companies have to cover contraception. That's something that the regulators came up with after the fact.
I did a video once talking about this, about the consequences of all these regulations. I challenge you, find me one person in the country that they could not bust for breaking some regulation on the books.
Yeah.
There's no such person. So when people tell me, oh, well, the government wanted to stop some evil company from doing something bad, but they were powerless to, or something like that, I have to call utter shenanigans on that. These are the same people who, when they couldn't bust Al Capone, they just nailed him for tax evasion. Is there one person in the entire country that they couldn't do that to if they really wanted to? So if a company's doing bad things and they're getting away with it, it's because the government chose not to act. There's no other explanation.
And really, if they want to regulate it, all they have to do is just make up a regulation, because that's what they're doing anyway. You know, this stuff is just written by regulators to do whatever after the law was passed. You know, what else might these unelected regulators just up and decide is the law that you and I have to follow?
Indeed, they love it that way.
And these aren't guys we elected. We can't vote them out of office. And you may agree with the contraceptive thing, but what's to stop them from turning around and doing it with something you don't agree with, like chiropractic or acupuncture or homeopathy or something like that?
Last I checked, Britain's precious system actually funds homeopathy. Something I always like to bring up to them when they try getting smug with me.
Yeah.
And they usually get mad at me and refuse to answer.
Well, there are some states as well that mandate that in the insurance coverage, things like acupuncture and chiropractic. And, of course, all it does is raise the premiums for everybody. And it's like people, when they were discussing this, were only looking at half the equation. They're like, okay, well, now young women can be able to afford contraceptives because it'll be covered. Well, okay, but why should an infertile couple be forced to pay for contraceptive coverage? What if you're a male who's had a vasectomy, or a female with a tubal ligation, and you've already taken care of the whole contraceptive thing? Why should you have to pay a higher premium?
Any guy working a $10 an hour job can afford to buy a box of condoms. Contraception's not that huge of an issue on the guy end.
Well, this is something that I want an answer on. And I'm asking this as an honest question, I don't know. But that woman who testified in front of Congress, I'm sorry, I forget her name. I would mention if I could, but she was one who Rush Limbaugh called her a slut and said if she wasn't such a slut, you wouldn't need all that contraceptives, which of course is BS. But it was something like she was having to spend so many thousands of dollars a year on her birth control pills. Well, I looked it up. Walmart and Target both sell birth control pills for $9 a month. And I don't have a calculator handy, but 9 times 12, if I remember my times tables correctly, doesn't go into the thousands of dollars. So is there like some special kind of contraception that some women need if they're like allergic and it's like this high dollar thing, or what? I don't get it.
Maybe there's a condition out there that the average generic birth control pill doesn't consider, but at the same time, I like spicy nacho Doritos, and apparently nobody else likes spicy nacho Doritos, so
Well, I don't know. We're a bunch of guys, and so I don't feel quite right about talking about women's birth control. So I really want to hear from a woman somewhere. Go somewhere into the podcast page or the Bogosity.tv forum or somewhere and answer me this question. What kind of birth control costs that much? I really want to know.
If it exists, I can't say I've ever heard of it.
And if it's a legitimate medical issue where over-the-counter birth control or condoms or some other, means of fairly cheap contraception, I'd love to be proven wrong on things, and so I would like to hear what condition could lead to that.
The reason why contraceptives are $9 at Walmart and Target is because they're competing with each other. Walmart wants you to come buy their antibiotics from us, because people are going to seek the right price. Target said, whoa, we're losing business because they're offering $9 contraceptives, so we'll start offering $9 contraceptives. But if everyone can get contraceptives through the insurance company, they don't have any incentive to shop around. And so if contraceptives are $40, $50, $100, they don't even know. They just show up and they get their contraceptives, and maybe they sign a piece of paper to say they picked up a prescription drug, and then they walk out the door and they don't have any incentive to say, hey, I want to shop around and get the best price on it. And so you never even get $9 contraceptives to begin with.
Yeah, great example of people not understanding insurance policies. I ended up, after I got a DUI, the state of Florida mandates that you have so many hours of psychiatric evaluation as part of the punishment. My dad is like, all right, you're not going to being on our insurance, you're going to pay them out of pocket. They're charging the insurance company like $190 per visit. So I'm like, okay, so how much do I have to pay to do a cash basis or write a check? Like, $55. I'm like, wait, what? So, and there were plenty of stories like that about how, insurance, because people don't, doctors' offices charging a shitload more for the insurance than they do out of cash, both because A, people don't realize what's going on, and B, the extra hassles of insurance.
This is a direct question I've wanted to ask a lot of people who support these policies. Like, they say the government provides free healthcare, and then when I say, no it doesn't, taxes, and then they say, okay, yeah, we do pay it through taxes, but it's cheaper that way. First, I ask them, how do you know that? They won't publish the numbers. And secondly, how do they make it cheaper? Like, you don't have a competition mechanism, you don't have the market signals, you don't have all these things. The government is, at best, another middleman, so how exactly do you add a middleman and get a cheaper price? And they won't answer. It's like people saying, how'd the universe come to be? God did it. Okay, how did he do it? It's like they've never even been asked that question before.
Yeah, like government has access to some kind of pot at the end of a rainbow that's just filled with healthcare and stuff like that. I mean, it's just like people, even skeptical atheist people who don't believe in supernatural or magic anything, all of a sudden, government is magic.
Let's say the government does have the power to do this. Why stop at healthcare? Why not make everything cheaper? Why not make everything free?
Yeah, I think it was John Stossel who did the thing of, why don't we do this with groceries? People need food. You don't want poor people to go without food, do you? So let's have food insurance and let's have a mandate to do it. And so I'll go to Harris Teeter and I won't buy a hamburger. I'll get steaks and I'll get the top cuts and the big stuff for as long as it lasts, of course.
Well, government in theory could do that thanks to the Federal Reserve. I hate to say the S word, but it's not even socialist. It's
screwed up. There's an S word for you.
Amalgam hybrid of socialism and corporatism, and incorporates all the worst parts of when you get government into something. Is capitalism a perfect system? No. It has its shortfalls in some ways, but damn it, it's a hell of a lot better than this. A free market healthcare system, we would have McDonald's versions of doctors' offices.
Well, some of them are trying to do that already, like these mini-clinics in CVS, and I think I read that Walmart was going to start doing them as well, where you can go in and they advertise their prices, and so you can actually shop around from one to another. I think the mini-clinic around here is like $65 to go in for most stuff.
Somebody like a physician's assistant, which basically takes about 2 years of school and a few other things. Somebody who's just basically trained to, all right, this is a cold.
Or a nurse practitioner. That's what a lot of them use.
Yeah, a nurse practitioner. I mean, they could do about 80% of American medical needs. And sure, yeah, they'd be working for $10 an hour, but that's because they'd be a dime a dozen. And then, of course, once you get into the real doctors, the ones who are dealing with major ailments, diagnosis, things like that, a doctor like House in a real free market system would command $1 million a year or whatever.
Yeah, I was a nurse practitioner who diagnosed my prostate infection a number of years ago and, got me the prescription for antibiotics. And, there was nothing wrong with that. That's a fairly straightforward thing to do. And we've seen before, like it used to be the case that you had to be a physician with a medical license to use the defibrillator. The thing when they start your heart and they have the paddles and they go clear. And at that point, they were really expensive and really difficult to use. And then I don't remember exactly when it was, late 70s or maybe the 80s or something like that. Nurses and rescue workers lobbied the government to deregulate it so that they could go through the training to learn to use them too, so they wouldn't have to wait for a physician to come around, or they could have an ambulance to do it on site and save a lot of lives that way. Well, and when they did that, all of a sudden the competition that opened up from that meant that over time, the defibrillators not only got cheaper and cheaper, they got easier and easier to use. And now, if you're someone who has heart disease and you're at risk for it, for less than $1,000, you can buy a defibrillator that you can use on yourself. That is what the free market can do for us.
Something else, in Florida, the only difference between a physician's assistant and your family doctor is that the family doctor has to be the one who signs off on a prescription narcotic.
And he's the one who drives the Beamer.
Exactly. Well, assuming he gets out of the couple extra $100,000 in debt. PAs, I think, only have to have 2 years of school, and that 2 years of school is even cheaper than the first semester of med school.
Wow.
There's a couple things we can learn from this, and a couple pieces of advice I'd like to give to anyone listening to this. The first one is, don't stress over this stuff. Very bad for you. Government right now is out of money, and all their promises are falling apart. I've seen this happen up here. Our politicians are just coming up with lamer and lamer excuses to add more taxes, to add more power. They're just grabbing everything they can before everything falls apart. So all this is going to do is gradually test everyone's willing to suspend their disbelief until even the hardcores are going to just be going, what am I defending? These people have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. So don't stress about this. This is just the kind of closure that a lot of statists still need before they can accept that their belief is wrong, and they need to start coming up with different ways of thinking about how to solve society's problems. So don't go thinking that you can protest this away. It's not going to happen. There's way too many special interests. There's way too many people with way too much money at stake on this. All you can do is keep people informed, tell them the truth about what's going on, and hopefully it'll make the transition that much less painful.
Don't not protest this. If there's a protest being organized by, your local libertarian party or whatever local group is doing it, show up. The more people, the more likely it might get on the news, the more likely...
Do it to educate people. Don't do it because you think the government's listening. They're not. They absolutely are not.
That's not to say, even if the government isn't listening, in my state house campaign, I've done a bunch of flea market booths. And what makes me coming home happy at the end of the day is the 3 or 4 people who always ardently say they hate my guts, and after about 10 minutes, they say, you know what, you are completely right.
Yep.
It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's so good.
Be an educator. Don't be a political activist. That's a waste of time.
My history teacher was telling me, he offered me to come in to speak to his class about libertarianism and also third parties and the issues they have in the political system. And there's this one particular snotty-mouthed kid who, pretty much kept calling me crazy. And then in the second semester, my old teacher showed the current class USDebtWatch.org, I think it is, which is the big site that has the current running debt totals.
There's the debt clock, the one that has all the numbers ticking up.
Yeah, maybe that one's it. But the student was like, well, why don't they raise taxes? Why don't they do this? Why don't they do that? And he was like, well, the student realized, he was like, wow, the guy who was calling crazy was right all along.
Who would have imagined?
Yeah.
That's become my smoking gun these days, because when you really think about it, all that really means is you're racking up a bill and then dumping on the next generation. I have challenged people, try to morally defend that to me. Just try. They won't. They won't touch it. Selling your kids, you can't make a case for that.
Yeah.
And here's the sad thing. I made my speech in front of what was supposed to be one of the top high schools in America. A school that's consistently ranked in like the top 20 schools in America. More people could tell me who Snooki was than who knew of the Occupy movement and the Tea Party.
Jeez.
For all their efforts. Yeah, people say people will never change their view on politics, but I like to remind them. People used to think slavery was totally okay. They used to think trusting the priesthood to run their lives was totally okay. And now those ideas are considered insane. You could never sell them to people. This is just the next logical step.
It's easy to let ourselves get down with this and all the other stories that we cover in the podcast, but I just want to say, don't let this get you down. It's still a good world with so many good people in it, and we still, both in the US and in Canada and in most other places, have a tremendous amount of freedom. Don't let this get you so down that you don't seize the day, grab that freedom, and live your life to the fullest.
Yes, indeed. My last piece of advice, I say this as somebody who lives in a country with socialized medicine right now. Take care of your health. Really, really take care of your health. I am telling you, for your own sake, for the sake of everyone you love, do not base your life around government handouts. You are going to lose badly if you do.
Well, that wraps up this ObamaCare, Billionaire, Vanity Fair, Bill of Fare, Camel's Hair, Solar Flare, Prickly Pear, Desperate Prayer, Nom de Guerre, Potty Chair, and Just Don't Care edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums of Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@Bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening, and thanks to my co-hosts, Jonathan Loche and Tim Dyson.
Thank you very much for your kind attention, everybody. Until next time, be aware and be wise.
And hey, if you truly don't like Obamacare, vote for the only candidate who will actually repeal it come November, Libertarian Gary Johnson.
Until next time, here's a quote from Harry Browne. There was a time when health insurance was available to everyone at a modest price. But after 40 years of government intervention, insurance companies have had to restrict their policies and charge far more, which has led Congress to pass bills forcing insurance companies to do what they once did gladly. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Imported License.